There are going to be statements today from Alaska Attorney General Craig Richards, John Skidmore, the Director of the Criminal Division of the Alaska Department of Law, and from United States Senator Dan Sullivan. After those statements are completed, we'll open it up for questions from the speakers. All right, and now, Attorney General Craig Richards.
Thank you for coming today. As some of you may be aware from articles in the paper and other statements coming out of the Department of Law, we are currently in the process of putting through the budgetary review process the creation of a public integrity unit. And that public integrity unit within the Office of Special Prosecutions would be really focused on three areas. It would be on death in correctional facilities, officer-involved shootings, and then allegations of public corruption. And as we've begun to think about increasing our resources and our capacity in public corruption cases, there's no greater face of that problem in the state of Alaska than those associated with Bill Allen and the VICO scandal. And I think, like a lot of Alaskans, people within the Department of Law and the Criminal Division, and I know myself personally, have felt a sense that justice was never truly fully served, that due to the particulars of that case, particularly as relates to potential minor victims of Mr. Allen's, that the ball got dropped. Well, the Department of Law does have options. Those options, time has passed and they are fairly limited, but the one that we do have and that we know we have is to potentially prosecute Mr. Allen under the Federal Mann Act. The Mann Act was a statute created in 1910 that basically prohibits interstate transportation of an individual with the intention of engaging such individual in sexual activity. It's a federal law, it's a federal charge, but under federal law, the U.S. Attorney General can cross-designate a state prosecutor to bring Mann Act violations into federal court. On two different occasions, once by Attorney General Dan Sullivan and once by Attorney General Mike Garrity, the State of Alaska Department of Law has requested that cross-designation so that we could bring charges against Mr. Allen. Unfortunately, with not much explanation in the past, both of those requests were denied. But things have changed. Attorney General Sullivan is now U.S. Senator Sullivan, and he had the opportunity when he was in the Senate in the last year to bring forward amendments that ultimately were carried to the Mann Act. Those amendments really did two things from the state of Alaska's perspective as relates to this particular instance. One is that it sets a standard that the cross-designation of a Mann Act violation will occur unless the U.S. Attorney General determines that doing so would undermine the administration of justice. That creates a standard which we feel has changed the law such that a cross-designation now should be granted. In the alternative, Mr. Sullivan's amendment provides that if in fact it is determined that granting a cross-designation would undermine the administration of justice, that within 60 days the U.S. Attorney General will provide a detailed explanation as to why that is the case. And that matters in this matter because, of course, there has been a longstanding supposition, maybe even an expectation, that immunity deal was cut with Mr. Allen that basically allowed him to not be prosecuted for the crimes committed to his minor victims in return for his testimony against U.S. Senator Ted Stevens in his political corruption trial in 2008. So this morning I sent a letter to U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch requesting that the cross-designation under the new statute be provided. I want to make it clear that this is not a shot across the U.S. Attorney General's bow. In fact, the opposite. This wasn't on her watch that the prior designations were denied. And in fact, it wasn't even in this administration in which, if an immunity deal was cut, that it would have occurred. So I request that she take this opportunity to right this wrong for the state of Alaska and give us the opportunity to pursue justice against Mr. Allen to the best way we can. And at the very least, and at the very minimum, that the Department of Justice come forward with the truth as to the full scope and extent of any deal that was cut with Mr. Allen in terms of immunity against prosecution for his minor victim crimes in return for the testimony against Senator Stevens. So with that, I'll turn it over to John Skidmore, the head of the Criminal Division, who will provide a little more detail. John?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. What I can tell you is that back in 2010 and 2011, the Department of Law's Criminal Division requested materials related to this investigation. Some of those materials, some of that investigation was conducted by the Anchorage Police Department. I'd like to take this opportunity for thanking the Anchorage Police Department for their full cooperation in providing us the materials they did and for the excellent work that they seem to have done in their investigation. But that wasn't the only information that was available. We were also requesting information from the Department of Justice. We know that the FBI had been involved in the investigation as well. And in our request to obtain that information, we had responses back to the extent of they are reviewing and will provide releasable FBI and grand jury documents. The fact that they're reviewing what's releasable suggests to us that they did not provide us all of the information that was available and known to them. We did review the information in that investigation and came to the conclusion that we would not be able to file any state charges against Mr. Allen for anything found in that investigation. However, our review did suggest that there were potential Mann Act violations. We cannot tell you at this time that that is something we could move forward on completely because we haven't seen all the information. We want to know the rest of the information that the Department of Justice has so that we can determine if there are appropriate Mann Act violations, then we'd like to be able to pursue those. And that's why we asked to be cross-designated in the past. Not only did they tell us they wouldn't cross-designate us, they told us that they had made the determination that they were declining to prosecute in federal court. And that's why we sought the ability to be able to do that. It unfortunately was not something that could previously be forced. However, as time passed, we were fortunate to have a strong advocate in the U.S. Senate, in Senator Dan Sullivan, who was able to sponsor legislation that essentially requires them to either cross-designate us or to give an adequate explanation. What we want out of this entire matter is truth and justice, nothing more. But it's that new law that will allow us to get there. And so with that, I'll turn this over to Senator Sullivan to explain more about his accomplishments.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Morning, everybody. It's great to be here again. Spent a lot of time in this building. Some of these outstanding public servants here in Alaska. I want to begin by complimenting Attorney General Richards and the Department of Law, not only on what they're doing today with the letter that you see, but also the AG Richards' new focus on public integrity section. I think the action today fits squarely within that focus. Now, look, many of you are very familiar with the long, complicated history and background in this case. I'd like to compliment the former Anchorage Daily News. We have a couple articles from 2010 that were written that really go into detail about what we're talking about. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the detail. It's provided here, I think, accurately in those articles. But for years, Alaskans, whether editorial writers, private citizens, state attorneys general, even our senior senator, Lisa Murkowski, have been asking officials at the Department of Justice the same question, which is, why did you not prosecute Bill Allen for alleged sexual abuse of minors and human trafficking charges, or at a minimum, grant the state of Alaska the ability to do so with a cross designation? And more specifically, as Attorney General Richards mentioned, was there some kind of deal? Is the Department of Justice actions in protecting Bill Allen from federal or state prosecution a result of some kind of plea deal to get him to testify against former Ted Stevens, who was, of course, exonerated in that rather lurid case of corruption that was not corruption. There was corruption on the part of the Department of Justice officials. And despite the insistence in asking these questions over years, the Department of Justice has consistently brushed off directly answering them. Well, that ends today. That ends today thanks to Attorney General Richards' requests that you see in the form of the letter to Attorney General Lynch to cross-designate Alaska in the Bill Allen human trafficking case pursuant to a new law that was signed by President Obama a few months ago. Let me talk just briefly about that law. I think you have copies in front of you. It was a law that I authored But importantly, it had very broad co-sponsors within the United States Senate. Democrats, Republicans. It's pretty self-explanatory. As Attorney General Richards said, the Attorney General of the United States shall, that's a strong word in the legal profession, shall designate or cross-designate the state of Alaska, any state AG who asks to be cross-designated in a Mann Act case unless it would undermine the administration of justice. And if it does, she has 60 days to provide a detailed explanation of why. Importantly, our Attorney General asked her to answer the question. If she's going to go that route, she needs to answer directly the question, if you look at his letter. Now, this is obviously an important issue for Alaska, but as you look at the Mann Act law, this is also a very important issue for the country. This is why the bill that I sponsored, and it was attached to a broader human trafficking bill, had such bipartisan support last year in the U.S. Senate. The reason that it had such bipartisan support is what this bill does is that one of the big problems on human trafficking nationally, and of course in our state, is we don't have the resources to go after some of the perpetrators. What this bill does is it allows much more resources, not just feds, but the state, to come after those kind of crimes. And remember, it says the Attorney General shall. Now, I believe Attorney General Richards is the first state Attorney General in the country to utilize this new law, and I certainly hope his actions today will set an example for other AGs to follow, because it will definitely help increase resources for the country to address the national problems of human trafficking. It's hard to predict with any certainty how the senior officials at the Justice Department will respond to Attorney General Richards' letter and requests. Obviously, they must follow the law that was recently signed by President Obama. And I do think, regardless of the outcome, one positive result of today's action is that it should be a deterrent, both in Alaska and nationally, but particularly in our state, that if you're a perpetrator of these kind of crimes, sexual abuse of minors, human trafficking, that the state of Alaska, state officials, federal officials working together are not going to rest until you are brought to justice and victims get justice. And I think John's point about truth and justice is exactly the correct one. I want to conclude by quoting an ADN editorial which sums up what I think we're doing here today in a very succinct and powerful way. This is an editorial from December 13th, 2010. I'm just quoting certain portions of it. The silence of the Justice Department on this matter leads naturally to the suspicion that the sex abuse case against Bill Allen was dropped as part of a plea deal to gain Allen's cooperation in the corruption case against Senator Ted Stevens. We don't know if that's true. We do know that the protection of Alaska's children is more important than a bribery case. We do know that the young women who came forward in this case not only were told, in effect, that the justice they sought would not be forthcoming, and we do know this sends exactly the wrong message about the value we place on the safety of our children and justice victims, particularly the most vulnerable, including Native girls from Alaska's villages. Domestic violence and sexual abuse inflict continuing misery here in Alaska at well above national rates. We will not meekly accept the Justice Department as it refuses to prosecute what some of its own officials say was a strong case, and we will not stand by to be told that the reasons for their decision are none of our business. Alaskans still need answers. That was an editorial from the ADN in 2010, and I think it sums up a lot of the issues that we're focusing on today. With that, I think we can take questions.
Let's go ahead and start here in the room. Does anyone have a question?
Matt Hers with Alaska Dispatches. I have two questions for the Attorney General. like legal questions. One is, are there statute of limitations issues with the Mann Act that you have to be worried about? And two, is there any issue with like ex post facto issues with using the new provision in the law that was recently passed to go back and request prosecution of these alleged crimes that occurred many years ago?
The answer to both your questions is no. There is no applicable statute of limitations as would be applied in this case to the Mann Act, to Mr. Allen, and again, no ex post facto issues either. I'm impressed that you knew the phrase. That's good.
Other questions in the room?
Is there a time limit on when the Department of Justice has to respond to your request to allow you to investigate? You said 60 days to give a reason why. Is there a time limit in where she has to respond to your initial request?
I'll let Senator Stevens answer.
Yeah, according to the law, she has to respond within 60 days. And
That's for both requests?
yes, and the law says she shall cross-designate. So the presumption is that she's going to do it. That's why the presumption under the law, I should say, is that she should do it. And only if it would undermine the administration of justice. But then the law says she has 60 days to provide a detailed explanation if she's going to use that exception. And again, I think the power of Attorney General Richards' letter is he kind of helps her understand what we think would be very important in terms of the detailed explanation. If she's going to use that exemption, she needs to answer the question that the Department of Justice has not answered in over 7 years. It's never answered the question. He puts it directly to her in his letter, and I think that we'll either see a cross-designation or answers to the questions that the ADN editorial and hundreds of others of Alaskans have been asking for years.
When do you expect to have the answer to your request for cross-designation? Is there a timeline for that, do you feel?
As the Senator stated, our expectation is we should have an answer in 60 days.
Are there any questions on the phone? Any further questions in the room? Yes.
Paula Dobbin, Channel 2. Can you talk about the types of materials you're hoping that the Justice Department and or the FBI, I'm not clear on which agency exactly, but what kind of materials you're looking for them to hand over?
The FBI is part of the Department of Justice. So their letter to us indicates that they were reviewing FBI materials and grand jury documents. There's a federal law that says when documents are subpoenaed to a federal grand jury, they can't be revealed to anyone else that wasn't authorized to be pursuing what the federal grand jury was looking at. The cross-designation would actually allow us to review any documents obtained through federal grand jury subpoenas and should theoretically allow us to look at any FBI documents without the sorts of concerns that seem to have been expressed in the letter that they provided us. What those would be precisely, I can't tell you. I can only tell you that we are interested in being able to review all of the information to evaluate are charges appropriate, and if so, the ability then to pursue them.
And if after looking at all the material, you feel like there was a violation of the Mann Act, could you just clarify the type of prosecution that would go forward? It would be a state one or a
No.
state and federal
Cross-designation means that you have a state prosecutor that is authorized to prosecute a federal law in federal court, and that's what it would occur. That's not unusual. We have attorneys in our office right now that are cross-designated for certain types of prosecution. Some of them are environmental, some of them involve firearms, but there have been times at which people have been cross-designated for limited purposes. This just adds one more type of cross-designation that could occur.
And do you feel that there may be more than one victim? I mean, do you have any sense right now if it's limited to this alleged victim, Paula Roberts, I believe her name is, or do you think that there may have been more?
It's Department of Law policy not to comment on ongoing investigations. I wouldn't comment on anyone's names. In the state of Alaska, we actually have a statute that prohibits us from talking or naming anyone that's the victim of a sexual assault, a sexual abuse, or human trafficking. And it would not be ethical, quite frankly, for me to discuss the details of information that's not already out there in the public. So I'm going to decline to answer that question because I don't want to create an ethics violation there.
I can see that you wouldn't want to name a potential victim, but could you answer the question about whether you think there's more than one?
Again, that would be the type of information that is not public information right now, and so whether there was or wasn't, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to confirm or deny that at this time.
Carolyn Hall, KTVA. I'm wondering, is there any potential for this to be drug out beyond 60 days? Can the Attorney General request some sort of extension if we see this take even longer?
I don't see it taking longer. I mean, the law, you have a copy of the law in front of you. It's very simple, it's very short, and it's very clear. And obviously the lead law enforcement official for the entire country has an obligation to follow the law. Exactly. And I do want to add to what Attorney General Richards said. You know, it is true that Attorney General Lynch obviously had nothing to do with any of this. And I think that's very important to remember. I've spoken to her about this case in detail, but there is something that's important here. As I wanted to read that editorial because think about what is really going on, what possibly is going on. We're not for sure. But there is a lot of concern in Alaska that people who are the officials at the Department of Justice, the guardians of justice for the country, may have said, all right, to go after Ted Stevens, we are going to ignore, and not go after heinous crimes where victims are young girls. The Department of Justice shouldn't be doing that if it did indeed happen. So Loretta Lynch now, although it had nothing to do with it, she is subject to this law. And what I think she needs to do, if she's not going to cross-designate the Department of Law in this case, is directly answer this question, which I believe she's required to do according to the new law and according to Attorney General Richards' letter.
Nat Hurst with Alaska Dispatch News. Have you guys actually approached the Justice Department, like U.S. Attorney for Alaska or the AG's office in D.C. about this at all? Have you had any conversations with them? I mean, what level of contact have you had?
No, we haven't. I mean, we've obviously had contact in the past through a number of different letters and channels in the attempt to be designated, but Ms. Lynch will be receiving our letter for the first time this morning. So we certainly intend to follow up with her and hope to have positive dialogue. And again, to follow up on what the Senator said, I mean, this is really, I think, the opportunity for the Justice Department to right a wrong and to make clear and to provide clarity around what really happened. And if there was a deal cut and the deal was that helping prosecute Ted Stevens would result in Bill Allen not being prosecuted for sexual crimes against children, then we should know it. And if that wasn't the deal, then Alaskans should know that too. So this is really an opportunity, I think, for justice to follow the law and really let it be known what happened in this case.
And Nat, just to answer your question. So I have spoken to Attorney General Lynch about this matter at a long meeting with her about a year ago. So this was before the law was passed. And I made the same point that Attorney General Richards said. I said, look, you know, you obviously are coming into this job new. You had nothing to do with this. My state is still asking a lot of questions. It would be very useful if you could help us tie up the loose ends of justice that many Alaskans still feel have not been resolved. And I think now having a new federal law that mandates her to take such actions will help her get to the right answer on this issue for Alaskans. And look, I think this is an important issue for the country. The Department of Justice is the Department of Justice. These are supposedly the people wearing the white hats. And we need to understand what happened in this case to bring closure to it.
And is it appropriate for you as a congressional official to be taking that role with the administration and in this case here, trying to get the cross designation?
The prosecution in this case is clearly the result of the decision of the request for a cross designation is clearly the result of the decision of Alaska's Attorney General. My role was to do something that, as I mentioned, I think is beneficial to Alaska, but for the country, which is to have resources available to go after human trafficking cases that extend well beyond the Department of Justice. And we happen to have an Attorney General who's the first one who's going to take advantage of that. And I think it's great for the state. I think it's great for the country.
Steve McDonald, Channel.
We have time for one last question.
Alexis, Channel 11. I understand Bill Allen has served some time for bribery and tax violations. Do you know his whereabouts today?
I don't think we've looked into where Mr. Allen is currently. We have to do this one step at a time, and the first step is to have a cross designation that allows us to review all the material to determine if charges are appropriate, and then once they are, at that point we'll concern ourselves with the whereabouts of Mr. Allen.
I just, one final comment on what the senator said about, is it normal to have a senator at a press conference in the Department of Law talking about a criminal prosecution? And, you know, it's probably not normal. But it's also not normal that you have a U.S. Attorney General who saw justice in a case, wasn't able to get it because of some federal roadblocks, and was able to, once he became a U.S. Senator, remove those roadblocks. So I think this is a pretty unique case, and certainly kudos to the senator for using his position to empower the potential prosecution.
Is the whole Alaska delegation?
I'm sorry, we don't have time for any more questions.
We'll
Is
do
the
last
whole
one.
delegation behind this?
I'll let the senator answer.
Murkowski and Congressman Young, are they supportive?
I don't want to speak for them, but I think Senator Murkowski has a statement in the press release, and I'll let Congressman Young speak for himself on this. But Senator Murkowski has been asking, Nat, your question earlier, has been asking questions of the Justice Department for many years on this case as well, and again, has not really gotten satisfactory answers.
There is an immunity agreement. Can you undo that? If the feds did strike an immunity